Hello everyone, we're just waiting for a few more people to join. We'll start in a couple of moments. Right. So, welcome everybody. My name is Fiona Tomley. I'm the director of the GCRF One Health Poultry Hub, and I'm going to be your moderator for today. So, this event is part of a roadmap series that we're running, which is called Discussions for the Future of Poultry, People and Planet. They're happening every fortnight, and we are trying to address key issues for sustainable development from the perspective of nutrition security and the global poultry industry. And through this initiative, we're hoping to contribute to the United Nations call that we build back better after COVID-19 for the future we want. A few housekeeping notes. So today's event will last for 1 hour. It is being recorded and will be available on our Hub website, and a direct link will be sent to all registered attendees at the end of the event. Please put your questions to panelists through the Zoom Q&A function, which you can access at the bottom of your screens. For today, you will only see your own questions, and then later on, when the panelists start to answer questions, you will see those questions which are being put to them and which they're answering. So don't be put off by a blank screen. There will be questions coming in, you just won't see them. I will put as many of your questions as I can to our panelists in the allotted time. If your question is covered by a previous answer, or if we run out of time, please accept my apologies that you won't get a mention. There is an online discussion channel accessible from the website and from your registration link, so please do explore this to share your questions, comments, thoughts, etc. These online discussions will contribute to a series of briefing notes that we will be preparing from the series. So today's discussion is on pandemics, past, present and future. So with 1.25 million reported deaths already from COVID-19 across 193 countries, and more than 150 countries having instituted policies that limit movement and encourage social distancing, we felt it was very timely to reflect on previous pandemics, on lessons that can and should be learnt, and to consider how we might be more resilient in the future. And on this Remembrance Day, inevitably, we think about the link between World War I and the 2018 to 2020 H1N1 influenza pandemic that infected 1/3 of the world's population and killed at least 17 million people, possibly as many as 100 million. As we pause to pay our respects later today in many countries, let us remember that conflicts and other causes of food insecurity, poor nutrition, depressed immunity, poor sanitation, all increased pandemic spread and disease severity. And of course, in 1918, these factors contributed hugely to the devastating severity of the second wave of the flu pandemic. So before we start with the panelists, we have a poll that we would welcome your participation in. The poll should be coming up on your screens any moment now. And the question is, in the current pandemic, what worries you the most? Is it option 1, the virus, so deaths, illness, overwhelmed health services, etc.? Or is it lockdown and restrictions, the loss of businesses and jobs, reduced freedom, mental health issues? As soon as you answer the poll, it will disappear from your screen. So I'll just give you a moment to complete that. And now I'm very pleased indeed to welcome our expert panelists for today. First, welcome to Heather Quinlan. Heather is a writer, a filmmaker, editor, and a native New Yorker. Just last week, her new book on plagues, pandemics, and viruses from the plague of Athens to COVID-19 was published. Heather's joining us from her home in New Jersey, where it's currently 4 a.m. So thank you, Heather, for this big sacrifice, and I do hope you've had some coffee. Professor Stuart Reed is our second panelist. Stuart is the principal of the Royal Veterinary College in London, recipient of many scientific medals and awards for his services in the advancement of veterinary science and education. He's a specialist in veterinary epidemiology and public health, serves on lots of committees and advisory boards. So welcome to you, Stuart. Many thanks for joining us today. So each of you has got 10 minutes to present your thoughts, and at 9 minutes, a bell will ring, which we should hear in a moment. Have we got a bell? Well, maybe not. A bell will ring. You'll have a minute then to wrap up. If you go on longer than that, well, you know, who knows what will happen. Microphones might get turned off or people will be hauled off. Anyway, I'm sure we won't need that. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Heather Quinlan, who's going to give our first talk. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you everyone who's joined us. And yes, my name is Heather Quinlan, and yes, it's 4 a.m. where I am, but I am luckily wide awake and happy to join you. And I realize that there's probably not a lot I can tell you about epidemiology or veterinary medicine. I studied English literature. However, I guess what I will do is I will talk a bit, and essentially what I wrote about were, I have medicine obviously in the book, but also other parts that go along with plagues and pandemics, culturally, governmentally, politically, religiously, all those sorts of things. So just to begin, there are a few key messages that I was asked to talk about. And the first one I have is, if you're betting against nature, you will lose. Now, this seems to be rather obvious. We have that saying, you can't fool Mother Nature, and yet we keep trying to. And we keep thinking that we can, because we are humans and we have these wonderful brains and we walk upright and we have dominion over the world. And the truth of the matter is we don't. So what that means is, it means that when you bet against nature, you lose, because the guiding force for us in doing so most of the time is money. And nature isn't driven by money. Their weapons are pathogens. Ours are bulldozers and chainsaws. Chainsaws can't do anything to a virus. And when we do everything from burning down the rainforest to melting permafrost, we release these unknown pathogens and also drive people into territory they've never been, forcing them to encounter and eat animals they've never come across. And frankly, I believe we're lucky that COVID, or a version thereof, doesn't happen more often due to the devastation inflicted on our planet in the name of progress. Progress does not mean destroying the earth for a profit. Then, as mentioned, there's the idea that we have somehow conquered disease, in the sense that pandemics in our minds go, we think of Monty Python and the Holy Grail and Bring Out Your Dead, and the dead in wheelbarrows and people wearing sacks. That's a pandemic. But because we haven't seen that with COVID, and also because we haven't had any experience previously with pandemics, and the 1918 flu was kept under wraps, it's been very difficult getting what the corporate world would call people's buy-in on this pandemic. People don't want their freedoms taken away, but paradoxically, still having the freedom to eat at restaurants or go shopping makes it seem that it's not that bad, and that they're being lied to for some reason, or people are trying to get one over on them. Another topic that I wanted to bring up was the reason that this is happening, in my mind, is that schools need to add pandemics, why they happen, how vaccines work, to their curricula. So why do we need a flu shot every year? If you ask a lot of people, they'll say, because we do. We accept it as a part of life, just as we accept the change of seasons. Pharmacies offer them and we abide. But the thought process doesn't really go beyond that. Now, illness plays a huge part in a very young person's life. One of my earliest memories is being so sick with the flu that I couldn't lift my head off my mother's lap in the pediatrician's waiting room. And in kindergarten, I was one of the lucky ones who got my tonsils out and got ice cream, lots and lots of ice cream. And yet, when it comes to teaching illness, disease, even simply the difference between a virus and a bacteria, we wait till adolescence. And even then, the body is competing with curricula, at least the type that I've gone through, that teachers must teach, which includes things like the circulatory system of a grasshopper, which is fine to learn, but it competes with materials that we need to know to better understand when something like this happens, what exactly is going on. Teaching children about the unbelievable simplicity of a virus, or the fact that one bacteria can give immunity to another, like a game of tag, is fascinating. Why HIV looks like it does is fascinating. The military force behind your immune system is fascinating. And it's also critical medical knowledge for a person to have, and a way to loop in students such as myself who don't normally gravitate towards science. And finally, the media does play an enormous role when it comes to people's perceptions of epidemics and pandemics. So without being armed with that knowledge, we rely on people who we believe are experts to educate us. And they could legitimately be experts, but they might not. And I'll cite with vaccines, the Operation Warp Speed, for instance, speed being thought of as the critical component to getting a vaccine ready and out there in time. And as we know, speed, for lack of a better term, is not an ingredient that's needed in developing a vaccine. People don't understand the testing and retesting that goes into developing it. With speed, you risk mistakes or putting out an unsafe product. And I'll just read very briefly about what happens when that does happen. In the winter of 1976, a novel influenza caused hundreds of respiratory infections at Fort Dix, a New Jersey Army post. The virus appeared to be closely related to the 1918 flu pandemic that killed over 100 million people globally and struck Army bases filled to the brim because of World War I. These coincidences caused health officials to start planning for what could conceivably become large and deadly outbreaks, if not an actual pandemic, as the cold weather progressed. The WHO took a wait-and-see attitude to track the number of emerging infections before crying pandemic. However, then US President Gerald Ford's administration took a different tack, a zealous campaign to vaccinate every American, stat. In late March, President Ford announced the government's plan to vaccinate, quote, every man, woman, and child in the United States, end quote. Emergency legislation for the National Swine Flu Immunization Program was signed shortly thereafter. And 6 months after the virus first appeared, high-profile photos of celebrities and even President Ford himself were photographed getting vaccinated. This was the dawn of a new day in modern medicine. Except it wasn't. Within 10 months, nearly 25% of Americans, or 45 million people, were vaccinated, but due to the pressure of creating immunizations for a brand new virus, the government used a weakened live virus for the vaccine instead of an inactivated or killed virus. With President Ford's re-election campaign looming, the vaccination campaign began to be seen as politically motivated rather than in the public's best interest. And it turned out that the flu wasn't even related to the 1918 virus. And indeed, those who were infected with the flu only suffered from mild illnesses, while more than 450 people who were vaccinated developed Guillain-Barré syndrome. And that's the paralyzing disorder that researchers now believe might be the cause of FDR's paralysis. So we are not equipped enough with medical knowledge to always make the right decisions. We create what we call our own narrative. In America, we have Thanksgiving coming up, which is arguably our most popular holiday. It's the one people travel the most for. In this case, people want to keep up family traditions, and it's understandable. But the idea that maybe we do not have the kind of Thanksgiving this year that we normally do, so we can again, hopefully next year have it, is difficult to wrap our heads around. But I hold out hope. And one last thing I'll just read from to echo what Fiona opened with. Poverty and starvation play a role as much as quarantines and lockdowns. Over 820 million people are hungry, some of them poor and desperate for any kind of food. These factors are unprecedented on planet Earth. We know from the fossil record that no large-bodied animal has ever been nearly as abundant as humans are now, and consequences of this population spike are ecological disturbances and increasing viral exchanges, first from animal to animal, from animal to human, from human to human, sometimes on a pandemic scale. We invade the wild, which harbors so many species of animals and plants, and also so many unknown species of viruses and bacteria. We cut down trees, burn jungles, destroy ecosystems, and cage animals, and let these viruses loose. When that happens, viruses need a new host. Often, it's us. This goes hand in hand with governments that deal in denial and concealment. The distance from Wuhan or the Amazon to Paris, Toronto, or Washington is short for some viruses, measured in hours, given how well they ride with airplane passengers. Long term, when the coronavirus is over, it must not be classified as a novel event or a misfortune that befell us. It's simply part of a pattern of choices that we continue to make. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. But with the coronavirus, we can stop being stark raving mad. And that is the conclusion.
Thank you very much, Heather. That was great. Can I ask you one quick question before we move on? You didn't talk about it too much, but you do in your book. About the politicization of COVID, why has it become such a political issue? And are there examples from history where this has also happened?
Well, I think the 1918 flu is a great example because it was kept under wraps in America by President Wilson, who was reelected on the platform of "we won't send our boys overseas," and that is precisely what he did. So in order to keep up morale, there was no talk of the flu at all. For the book, it was very difficult for me to get, I couldn't get really firsthand accounts because it was so long ago, but even for people who were the children or grandchildren of victims of the flu, because it just wasn't mentioned. It just was not part of, like I say, the narrative back then for the sake of World War I. And I get into it a little bit in the book, but the president also contracted the flu, as did Franklin Roosevelt, and it led to some dire consequences when it came down to the Treaty of Paris, what happened with Germany, and what eventually led to World War II. So yes, it can have dangerous consequences.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to move now and ask Stuart Reed to give his presentation. Stuart, you have the floor for 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much indeed for the opportunity of speaking to you today. I'm going to share a few slides with you. So I'll just give that a second to come up. I think that should be us up and running. Just to echo Fiona's words that it is appropriate we're talking about pandemics today, over 100 years since the Great War that took place on planet Earth, this small place that we call home. And Fiona talked a little bit about the number of people that died during the war, but double the number died in the influenza pandemic that then followed it. And I think going back through time, we have to remember that disease is the great killer. If you think of the bubonic plague Black Death that ravaged Europe for, let's be honest, well over 400 years. That took out about 50% of the population of Europe and probably a lot more besides. And just to turn to the pandemic of today and looking at the data that we have available to us, it's worthwhile remembering that in North America alone, with its advanced medical technologies, something in the order of 4 times the number of people who died during the Americans who died during the Vietnam War have died. It's the equivalent to three jumbo jets going down every day, or the 9/11 atrocity occurring on 66 consecutive days. So the scale of death, even in this relatively short pandemic that we have been facing recently, is enormous. And we should never forget that. They're not short-lived, and they have huge impacts on society. I'm going to, rather than start with some factual accounts by others, I want to turn to a piece of foresighting that was done by the American Veterinary Medical Association, the Association of American Veterinary Medical Colleges, and the Canadian Veterinary Medical Association back in 2005. And they were foresighting what the future would look like for veterinary medical education. That's a by the by. This is 2005, and at the end of the piece of work, they generated 10 vignettes. And these vignettes were visions of the future. And I'm just going to read a very brief excerpt from one of them. And this one is called The Doomsday, the Pandemic Disaster of 2015 to 2025. Bear in mind, we are now right in the middle of that period, something that was written 15 years ago. Keith Smith had just returned from his 17th vaccination for a zoonotic-based disease in as many years. After the great scare of mad cow disease, or BSE, there had been the chicken hemorrhagic fever disease, swine influenza, avian flu, raccoon fever, and many others, including Ebola. Each new wave brought a more frightening array of symptoms and a growing risk of mortality, and further weakened the public health system. Public confidence in the government's ability to deal with these crises was at an all-time low. Many of these pathogens were unknown previously in the country, but became widespread with the increasing temperatures and the growing frequency of the extreme weather events such as hurricanes and flooding. The increasing number of pandemics was an unfortunate side effect of climate change. The war against terrorism of some 20 years ago was long forgotten. The new enemy was invisible, microscopic, and viral. Over the last 2 decades, a fifth of the global population had perished, and the overwhelming majority of these illnesses came from animals. The times were eerily reminiscent of the Great Plague in 13th century Europe. As I say, written 15 years ago, and really could not have been more foresightful if it had tried. Now, I recognize in the very short time I have with you that perhaps when we talk about pandemics, we think about the disease impact on humans. And this is a picture taken by the construction company of the Nightingale facility in the United Kingdom, this one I believe in Manchester, in preparation for the wave of critical care beds that were anticipated in the first wave of the COVID pandemic in the United Kingdom. And I'll come back to this picture towards the end. But rather than thinking just about the disease implications, Heather's already touched upon some of the other aspects. And this is an illustration from many years ago, which talks of rinderpest. And rinderpest was only the second disease to be eradicated from the planet, the first being smallpox. The rinderpest was cattle plague. And whilst it wouldn't have any direct impact in terms of the infection of humans, of course, the supply of protein and the disruption to food chain was massive, as any pandemic would be, even if it did not affect clinically by infection humans. So that got me thinking a little bit. If we're thinking about where we're going with the control of pandemics, what are the factors that we need to consider? And we can't look at just humans or just animals. In fact, if we then start to think about the risks that are brought about by the way in which we live our lives, and again, Heather has touched on some, I would encourage you to spend some time reflecting on one of the links that I put in the blog that accompanies this webinar series. And if you take the world as we know it today and we overlay it with population growth, if we overlay it with where there is poverty, if we overlay it with where we expect there to be the need for protein and animal protein to support that human population growth, not just the protein, but the micronutrients that accompany products of animal origin. And if you overlay on that the paucity of human healthcare services, and overlay on that the paucity of veterinary healthcare services, and perhaps even overlay on that where we're likely to see incursions into habitats of which we have not previously held dominion. And if you overlay on that perhaps where we would see most vector-borne diseases, you've almost got the perfect storm. In fact, you have got the perfect storm. And the human expansion of the human population and the need for it to feed itself will ultimately prove to be one of the major risks for pandemics. Now, classically, when we talk about One Health, and I realize that the previous webinar in the series spoke a little bit in more general terms about One Health, this triumvirate is really what underpins most teaching of most infectious disease in medical schools, veterinary schools, and wherever else. And it's this bringing together the host, the pathogen, and environment that brings you to a point where perhaps at the intercept of this Venn diagram, in the middle of the three circles overlapping, that one would expect One Health to be most manifest. And of course, that's correct. An important addition I've put to this one, it usually says host, pathogen, environment. I think for the purposes of this morning, we really ought to be looking at hosts, pathogen, and environment, so hosts in the plural. But for me, there are issues around just regarding this as a kind of single or rather two-dimensional diagram. We have to consider how we bring these together in a way that addresses a One Health solution, as may have been described perhaps most effectively by the FAO, I think in their aquaculture program. And here they take the concepts that perhaps Schwabe is best known for promulgating his Cattle Priests and Progress in Medicine, or Veterinary Medicine and Human Health. In those two texts, he outlined, I think, what has been the basis of our One Medicine or One Health. But I think taking the approach that we have today to the next level requires us to be a bit more strategic. And so this at least the three levels drawn from thinking and promulgated by the FAO, as I say, speaks to me of what a One Health solution can look like. And if we take that Venn diagram of the previous slide, where we've got hosts, pathogen, and environment, and then we consider three different levels. So in order to effect a One Health solution, in order to prevent, in order to manage a pandemic, you need a technical level solution. And just in these last few days, we've heard that we may have at least a contribution to that technical level solution in the vaccine. For other diseases, it might be we need an appropriate antibiotic, or we need to have bed nets that work in terms of protecting people from mosquito bites, or condoms that work. So in terms of controlling a disease, we need a technical level solution. But that's not enough. We also need the societal level solution, and that is that people behave appropriately. So if there is a vaccine available, it is not going to be the exit strategy if only 40 or 50% of the population use it. And finally, we need the institutional level. We need legislation, and we need intergovernmental support, and we need funding to make a One Health solution a reality. And it's only when these three come together that we can truly say that we're addressing things in a One Health fashion. And if any of you are familiar with my PowerPoint skills, you'll know that it took me an awful long time to make that slide, and I'm just going to let you enjoy it again. It's available for a small fee. So what of the One Health Poultry Hub? Well, my concerns are not my concerns, but the reality is that poultry are going to be the backbone of that expansion of protein. And as I said, it's not just disruption of the protein supply chain, it's also the fact that there may be zoonotic diseases that animals and humans share that also play into that. And I don't think anybody would doubt that the one disease that we thought we would be facing at the next pandemic is not this coronavirus, but actually influenza. And of course, influenza is a viral infection, which does afflict poultry populations. So I hope we will have time to talk about some of the drivers for this, but what I'd like to do is just in closing, speak a little bit about lessons learned. This is from the TB pandemic, one might argue, but dates back to 1889, and I draw you to the second paragraph. It is suggested by high authorities that possibly a number of human maladies may be traceable to animals, and that the public would be best protected by conjoint action on the part of experts from the two branches of medical practice. The two branches of medical practice, that's human medicine and veterinary medicine. And secondly, I showed you the Nightingale Hospital at the start of my presentation. This isn't a Nightingale Hospital. This is a hospital. from the pandemic that took place in 1918. This one, of course, is monochrome, but the similarities are remarkable. And most finally of all, you know, they knew how to do it back then. Why can we not get this through to the population today? Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart, that was great. So just quickly, before we've got quite a few audience questions coming in, I quickly want to ask you, you talk very eloquently about One Health and the need for the different layers. So I want to ask you, you know, why isn't it happening? Where's the problem? Where's the block? Is it that we can't get people from different disciplines together? Is it happening but very slowly? Is it at the institutional level? Where's the big problem with One Health?
I think there's a certain element of the emperor's new clothes. Can I just check that I'm being heard okay?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. Emperor's new clothes. I think more to the point, we're I think at a tipping point, to be honest. One Health has been around for a little while now. A great encouragement to me was a recent workshop that was being hosted by the Fleming Fund, which is directed towards antimicrobial resistance, but is an initiative that covers the globe. Really, when the participants were asked what the benefits were of the approach that the Fleming Fund was taking to antimicrobial resistance, which is a pandemic, antimicrobial resistance is a pandemic in itself, the overwhelming response was that it was taking a One Health approach. And very many of the people that were attended that event were, of course, from the medical community. I think we probably do ourselves a disservice if we decide that we're not going to, if we're pointing only at the absence of, say, one particular professional group. I mean, we need to make sure that we've got social scientists, engineers, climate scientists, you know, if we are going to affect those three levels of intervention, technical, behavioral, and institutional. So absolutely the case. But I do think that one of the things that may well drive the One Health agenda is if we can find a way of credentialing One Health professionals. What is it that makes you a One Health professional? At the moment, there is not a real driver in that regard.
Thank you. Interesting idea. Okay, so we've got quite a few questions. So Heather, are you there? Do you want to come back in? And we'll start to go through these. I'll pick them up as I can. I'll try and theme them. But the first one in was Julian Drew, who's asking, this is a question about the poll where we lump together mental health, anxiety and depression along with the economy, not with the direct health effects, i.e. illness and death. And Julian's saying, is this not a false dichotomy? Would we be in a better position now if we gave more consideration to mental and societal effects of pandemics in both the short and the long term? Stuart, can I ask you to go at that first? I know you're a strong proponent of mental health you know, within the RVC. So what's your view on this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think I'll just put my day job hat on for a minute. You know, before we went into this pandemic, one of the things that was highest on the agenda with the population that I'm charged with looking after, that's the student population, we talked about the epidemic of mental health challenges. And all of a sudden that gets brushed aside. And one has to say that one of my big concerns with the approach to, in the absence of a good test and trace, requiring people to sequentially self-isolate due to being in contact with a potential positive is absolutely an issue that we do absolutely need to address. I mean, we can't keep putting people in 2 weeks out, 4 days in, sorry, 2 weeks in, 4 days out, 2 weeks back in again. And I think the news yesterday that there may be, at least for a while, that there's some optimism around a rapid test that could possibly shorten those periods of shutdown is actually really a big step forward. But the self-isolation is really very, very important. If you actually look at the risks in the over 70s for death, and you rank, I'm sorry, I can't remember where I'm citing this from, and I do apologize. If you put obesity, diabetes, smoking, and self-isolation in the and ask people in the over 70s and rank them in terms of risk to death, the two that come out on top around equal are smoking and isolation. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. Heather, there's a question here which is really for you from Judy Betteridge, saying she was very interested to hear you speak about disease as a non-medical person, and that you use quite a lot of combative language, weaponized, conquered, etc. So do you think this is a good way to talk about microorganisms when they are just part of the natural environment?
Well, I think it's a good way to get people to understand who aren't part of the medical community what exactly they do. In a certain way, I mean, my chapter on our immune system has a lot to do with basically being on a battlefield, getting intelligence, sharing intelligence, and so my use of things like weaponization and that is basically not to personify what these are, but basically just to put it into terms that a layperson would understand, and frankly that I would then understand if I see it. You know, they tell people, especially children who have cancer, to envision the cancer as some kind of enemy that they can fight. So it's almost sort of in that vein that I talk about it as such.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to a question from Chris Ura, who I remember from when he was at Pirbright many years ago. So Chris says, it's all well and good building swanky new hospitals with loads of intensive care beds when we do not have the intensive care specialists to man them. I think he means person them, really. The key word here is resilience. We need to build resilience in our health system so we can be better prepared to face future pandemics and the impacts of the current climate emergency. Any thoughts or words on that?
Totally agree. I know in the little blog piece I said, you know, the preparedness and rapidity of intervention are ways of perhaps controlling an epidemic or pandemic once you're in it. But you have to take a much bigger view on how you approach your planning when you're in peacetime. You can't expect to do it when you're in the heat of battle. And I think that's one of the things that we've learned. There's been an awful lot of investment of time, effort, and resource that when you do it in haste, inevitably is never done as efficiently.
Okay. Heather, do you want to comment or shall we move on? I've got another.
I would just say that, you know, surprisingly, we all thought that we were caught unawares by the pandemic, that we had very little in terms of preparation for it. But the fact was, even down to small towns had a pandemic playbook. It wasn't just big cities. It wasn't just Washington. It was small towns that, for instance, my uncle was the mayor in a town in Connecticut, and they had a pandemic playbook. But for whatever reason, when it came time to actually use it, it was not used. Why that is still a huge question mark, whether it was political or whether it was because for any number of reasons. That's almost the more frustrating thing, is that in a sense we were ready, but then when the time came, we weren't. And nobody really knows why. And that's a big question to answer.
Okay.
Yeah. I think because one of the interesting observations, of course, is that some of the countries in Asia who have had recent experience of other pandemics have done a lot better. One, they were better prepared. You can look at the number of intensive care beds available per head of population as one metric. Second, they made rapid intervention. And third, they made some rules and the population followed those rules. And you can't get away from the fact that test and trace in those countries was done at a level, on a log scale, greater than some other countries who perhaps should have known and done better.
I've got a couple of questions that relate to that, rather obliquely maybe, but I'll bring them in here because I think they pull out particular points. So the first is from Jim McGrain, who asks, what do the panelists believe would make the greatest contribution to increasing people's buy-in in advance of the inevitable next pandemic? So I think buy-in is kind of what we're talking about here, obeying the lockdown, complying to test and trace, etc. What's the biggest incentive for people, do you think?
You know, I maintain, unfortunately, that the people who are victims of COVID tend to be the wrong type of people. When we had the polio panic back in the 1950s, there were images of little children with crutches. And so who didn't want, I mean, people were not going into public swimming pools. People were obeying the rules in order to save their children. And the image of a child on crutches or a child in an iron lung or anyone in an iron lung is enough to frighten people into action. I find that with COVID, because it's not necessarily taking our quote unquote best and brightest, but a lot of times affecting the elderly and the poor and what, you know, people think of as populations that aren't ones that need us to make sacrifices for, then you lose that buy-in. And also because these are the people who are getting sick, you feel almost like you've been granted immunity, God-given immunity or from whomever. And also, you know, like Stuart said, we just haven't had the experience of dealing with this again and again. I think SARS, while it didn't hurt us as much, was almost like the boy who cried wolf a little bit for us, in that SARS, you know, everybody thought was going to be a terrible pandemic. It wasn't. So, you know, what's the big deal with this? And finally, education.
Stuart.
Yeah, I think you look at some of the other big public health campaigns, because this is really what it's about. It's about public health campaigns. I mean, it's very difficult to make something happen in the short term. I mean, if you look at how long has it taken us to get the message through about smoking, as an example, you know, it took a lot. It's taken us a long time to get there. I mean, that's all around the behaviours. And even if you look at how do we get people to wear masks during the pandemic, let alone what we've got to do about something that has not yet arrived. We need people to be able to trust those that are making decisions. And I think there's a malaise which goes way beyond public health here as to, you know, how do we trust our leaders and what faith we put in science. I mean, it's quite incredible to me that even with the death toll that we're looking at, that when one study, 43% of people who were surveyed in one country in the developed world said they were not going to be vaccinated. I mean, I just do not understand that. I really don't. But that comes down to sort of lack of trust in civil liberties and all that. I think the other thing, and I come back to how do you incentivize anybody to do anything? It's when, you know, if you want to back a winner, back self-interest every time. You know, and I think those people who've lost family members, they won't need any incentive to take this seriously. And I think that's unfortunately the harsh reality. Zika is a fantastic example. I mean, people were not concerned about Zika in the Americas, in North America, because it frankly wasn't affecting them. You know, but the minute it comes into your own population, the minute it starts affecting those that you know and love, then the attitudes change for sure.
Definitely. So linked to that, there's a question from Tony Barnett, who asks, what can we learn from the apparent differentially effective interventions between Western liberal democracies and East Asian authoritarian politics or policies?
Well, I have a sidebar in my book about draconian measures, because when COVID first came onto our shores, we were comparing how we handled it to places like China, who had draconian measures, and it was always draconian measures. And look at how they have to keep people, you know, in lockstep with what they want to do. And we are America and the land of the free. And we don't need these draconian measures, and yet we're still dying. So what it's difficult. It does kind of tie into that previous question and getting people's buy-in, yes, I completely agree. If it's you or someone in your family or someone you know, yes, you have immediate buy-in. When it's not, it's very hard to get people to understand and not think that they're being somehow lied to. Right now, obviously, we had an election and a vaccine came out right after the election. So people are saying, you know, this was politically motivated. You know, I think what it's going to come down to is sort of trying to meet the liberal with the draconian somehow and figure out a way, yes, to get the incentive for people. If it's not personal, is it financial? Is it some other way that we can incentivize people to take part in this?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to move us on. I think there's quite a few comments coming in about behaviours and need for change, etc. But I just want to change tack a little bit. We've got a question here from Khalid Mahmood, and it's really it's taking it through to agriculture and farmers. And his question is: when the world has got over 570 million farms that are small and family run, so these are small, less than 2 hectare farms, represents about 12% of the world's agricultural land. On many of these farms, the majority of people are unable to read and write. How can we expect that they will understand the concepts of One Health and the concepts of pandemics? There's a huge knowledge gap in the developing world. How do we fix that? Just a small question.
Well, sorry, Fiona, I thought that's what the Poultry Hub was going to fix. No?
Just chickens.
But I mean, in all seriousness, and Heather touched upon it in a slightly different environment. I mean, frankly, for our generation, the game's over. But I think looking to the next generation, it's got to be about education. It has to be about education at every level, and wherever that education might be taking place. And one has to still be able to demonstrate that back self-interest every time. There has to be something in it for the individual too. It's not good enough just to visit rules and regulations on somebody for the benefit of an unseen third party. There has to be something there that works for the individual.
Heather, a quick comment on that or not?
I will just say that even people who can't read or write doesn't mean they're not intelligent.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. There's a number of questions about education. I'm going first of all though to switch because we're getting close to needing to wrap. So I'm going to go to a question from Polly Compston, which addresses something rather different. And it's asking if you can comment on the lessons we can learn about the interface between science, public policy, and private concerns. And she says the scientific community has been discussing the next pandemic for years, but now it's happened, governments and intergovernmental agencies are failing to work together. And we can evidence this by different rules in different countries, for example. The role of big business in the creation of pandemics, for example, deforestation, monoculture, etc., has not had much public commentary. And scientists and researchers are sitting saying the same things they've always done. How can we change academic practice to become more acceptable and adapted by policymakers, the public, and big business? Big question, very important, and something certainly within the Poultry Hub that we're working very hard to try and find ways that we can do this by engaging with stakeholders from industry to policymakers to NGOs to communities right at the start when you're doing your explorations and your scientific and your social scientific research, trying to get people on board at the beginning. But we're a small bubble. How should scientists be addressing this? Stuart, I'll come to you.
Yeah, I listened to Jeremy Farrar speaking at the National Academy of Medicine a couple of weeks ago, and he spoke about the sort of conjoint failure of science, not necessarily to be doing bad science, but not being able to speak in a way that politicians were able to understand and accept, but equally the politicians who were unable to listen and hear. So it takes two, yeah, and not to lay it at any one person's or any one group's feet. I do think we've got to be a little bit careful because the public good element of what you've hinted at there, we are dependent upon private industry to deliver innovation and many other things. But government and the rules that we talked about a minute ago and how we manage society, I mean, we either fund the advances through taxes or we fund it through the philanthropy of the private sector. And actually, probably we need to do both. But one of the great stories I think that will come out of this pandemic is the fact that science and the commercial world have actually worked very closely side by side. I mean, there has been a collaboration in this vaccine development that we have never seen before. Of course, there's still competition, and actually competition is actually driving some of those advances, but there has been a collaboration that we haven't seen the likes of before across countries, across continents. So I think we do need to look for the positives that have come out of this crisis, as well as just the things that we could have done better.
Okay, thank you. There's a question here, which is a kind of follow-up. And again, I'm targeting this at you really, Stuart. It's from Julie Waterfield, who we know very well. Do you think the scientific community has presented itself in the best light during this pandemic? Heather might want to comment as well, yeah, as a non-scientist.
Let Heather go first.
No, Stuart, after you. No, I do believe, I mean, in the United States, we have Dr. Anthony Fauci, who has become the hero for a lot of people, who has been, you know, he's been working since the Reagan administration on infectious diseases, beginning with HIV/AIDS. So this isn't quote unquote his first rodeo. And he, whether you believe him or not, unfortunately tends to lie with what side you're on politically. Either he's in cahoots with Bill Gates to develop a vaccine, or he is the voice of wisdom. I choose to believe he's the voice of wisdom because he has been through so many administrations, both Democratic and Republican. And because he is able to get these concepts across in a way that possibly other people may not be able to. And he seems very approachable. So in that respect, you know, there are certain, I would say, celebrity scientists or celebrity physicians who have come to the fore with this, Dr. Fauci being one of them. And I actually interviewed him in my book. And what's interesting is, I'll just say real quick, he majored in the classics. He studied ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and then moved on to medicine. So I think having that wide swath of knowledge helps him communicate with others.
Yeah, there's the science of medicine and there's the art of medicine, so he covers both off quite nicely. I think, very briefly, Fiona, I think we, as a scientific community, we have to be careful that we don't present ourselves as providing the only truth. And that's when it becomes very dangerous. And people communicating uncertainty, and this is where I think we need other professionals in and around us, trying to explain and get people to work within an uncertain environment, when what's actually being looked for by our politicians are political, you know, the rights and wrongs, blacks and whites, whatever. You absolutely cannot do that. And being able to present yourself within this uncertain framework is really a really big task. And I don't know that we have done it as well as we might have. Well,
inevitably there'll be good and bad, you know.
Of course.
I'm going to move us on again. There's a lot of questions here still. We're not going to get through them. I apologize. I've tried to pick them from different kind of areas. There's a question here from Navneet Dand, which is about surveillance. So it's really targeted at Stuart. He says my question's for Stuart, but Heather, you're welcome to have a crack at it as well. So everyone agrees on the need to adopt One Health approach, but the implementation of the concept is very limited across the globe. Health, agriculture, environment ministries still work in silos. There are not many channels of formal communication between vets and GPs, and very limited progress has been made on establishing a global or even country level One Health integrated surveillance system. What do you think we need to do to put One Health into practice?
So, I mean, I touched on this a little bit earlier. In One Health, unfortunately, at the moment, still does mean different things to different people. And I think trying to get to the point where we have some sort of credentialing, I mean, and that might sound rather basic and techie and educational, but if you look at how most of the disciplines, get established and then become meaningful, it's because there are careers that are built around it. Now, put that to one side for a minute. I think one of the things that will come out of the lessons learned from this pandemic is that there hasn't been enough working together. If you look at, for example, if you look at the major drivers of most pandemics, I mean, one major risk factor is humans, number one. Where do many of the pandemics come from? Animals. Well, there's your motivation straight off. But then you look at the things that then drive a pandemic, whether it's the 4 T's, which is trade, tourism or travel, temperature in terms of climate change, and terrorism in terms of bioterrorism. All those things are really high-level strategic governmental type interventions. So creating ministries around this. In many countries, the agriculture and the medical ministries are usually separated, and not only separated, but miles apart and often in conflict for resourcing. So it's, I think, addressing it at the level of ministry rather than, as has happened, only happening at the level of intergovernmental organisation, which, as we have seen quite recently, are subject to people signing up for them or not. And if major countries decide to pull out from the primary One Health platforms, then it can be to everybody's disadvantage.
Thank you. Well, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to bring this to a close because we've basically only got a couple of minutes left. It's been a really stimulating discussion. Thank you to both of you. And I'd really like to thank both our panelists for you highlighting a lot of issues. And I think we have a slide that is going to come up. Yeah, okay. So this is really just to highlight the take-home messages that our panelists really wanted us to be thinking about. So the key take-home messages: if you bet against nature, you'll lose. Schools should educate children about pandemics, why they happen, and how vaccines work. Traditional and social media have a huge role in guiding people's perceptions of epidemics and pandemics. We didn't really touch on that in the discussion, but I think it's something that will possibly get picked up on the Slack channel later. There's no doubt that the expansion of animal-derived foods will continue to happen and will happen where population growth is the greatest. And this also coincides often with parts of the world where human and animal health services are not well developed. The major risk for pandemics, well, it's humans. We're the people who move the virus around, either directly or indirectly. And finally, the point about One Health solution requiring technical, social and institutional components. So thanks again to the panelists. For you in the audience, I'm just wondering what you might take away from this discussion. So we have another poll and we'd be very grateful if you would complete that. Can we put the poll up? Okay, so this is really, after listening to our panelists, how do you rate our chances of coping with the next pandemic? Do you think we'll be better than COVID-19, worse, or about the same? So if you'd like to vote on that. So again, I'm to thank our panelists, Heather Quinlan, good luck with the book, Stuart Reed, good luck with the college and the pandemic. And thank you to our tech team who are working in the background to make sure that everything runs. I also want to thank you in the audience for your interest and questions. Do please continue the discussions on the Slack channel, and you can access that using the link that you got at registration, or you can go via the One Health Poultry Hub website. The next event in this series is going to be on 25th of November. We're moving it across to really looking at poultry production in this one. It's called Keeping It Safe and Healthy. Our panelists are Claire Heffernan, who's the director of the UKRI Stunting Hub, and also Thea Panelists, who is the director of Commercial and Strategic Alliances at Zoetis, and Robin Alders from Chatham House will be moderating on that one. So with that, I'll wish you goodbye and thank you very much. Have a safe day and a good day, and see you next time. Thank you very much.